When you watch the mainstream media news, do you feel a little twitch? Is there a tingle in your left hand? Is your jaw locked? We have the solution. Welcome to Reasonable Arguments, the podcast where thoughtful debate meets unfiltered fun. Coming to you from Sarasota, Florida, where your hosts, Jamie Miller and Jennifer Bash, make sense of the chaos. Together, we mix informed conservative commentary, playful banter, and just the right amount of nonsense to keep it entertaining. This is Reasonable Arguments, and now your hosts, husband and wife duo, Jamie and Jennifer.
All right, well, happy Easter.
Well, this is after, today is Easter. We're both in our Easter purple.
Yes, we're both in Easter purple. We didn't even plan this.
No.
I changed.
Well, I've been wearing this all day.
Yeah.
So,
I changed after lunch, but
thank goodness this doesn't have smell-o-vision.
oh, Jesus. All right, so let's get into the program. So we are going to be talking about just some updates that are going on and happenings that are going on in
This is one of
the
my
political
favorite
world.
episodes. The ones where Jennifer does the show notes and keeps the topics from me. So everybody, you can get your fact checkers, play along, and see how right or wrong I am.
Great.
I have no idea what we're talking about tonight.
Great. Okay.
But I'm glad you do.
Yes. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is RFK and his autism speech. So the CDC just dropped a new stat that got everyone talking. Autism now affects 1 in 31 children in the U.S., which is up from 1 in 36 just a few years ago. In RFK's response in the press conference that he just held last week, where he called it an epidemic and announced a full-blown investigation into environmental causes.
I didn't go, and I don't know if you're going to go into, but it's much worse in boys. And in California, it's something like 1 in 12 boys is what I read. Like
Okay.
1 in 12 boys. And I think it's 1 in 20 boys nationwide. So just incredible statistics when you start thinking about 5% of boys nationwide are almost 8.5% in California. And that could be better diagnoses earlier. There's a lot of question about where, or is it just more people who are getting diagnosed, or, be interesting to look at blue state versus red state, or anyway, go ahead.
So
this is what happens when I don't get the show notes.
So one of the things that happened during this this press conference that had everybody in an uproar was where RFK claimed that autistic individuals will never pay taxes, never hold a job, never go on a date, and that did not go over well. Well, and I understand why people are very upset about that.
Yeah.
But and then he came back and said that he was really talking about people that are nonverbal, which I kind of disagree with too, only because, we have autism in our family. So we have Caitlin, who is going to be 30 years old this year. She wasn't supposed to live past the age of 13. She is verbal. I mean, she's like Rain Man and everything that she knows, but she will never live on her own. She will never do any of those things that he talked about. And those are the types of people that he was referring to.
People who really need to be taken care of.
Yes, that they cannot live independently. Caitlin will never be able to live independently. But she can talk. I mean, she's fine like that. So his comments were seen as deeply stigmatizing, implying that people with autism can't lead independent or fulfilling lives. And again, I think that he was referring to the people that can't. There's people that are diagnosed with autism that it's, just something simple. And I think it is more now because of the mental health crisis and everything like that, where everything has a label.
Yeah, we use words like the spectrum. Like, what does that mean? And, we've kind of talked about different people who we've run into, and like, oh, they're on the spectrum. And whether, there's a famous politician in Florida, people speculate is on the spectrum somewhere, but he's an elected official.
Yeah.
And so you wonder, if that entire spectrum, how much has that grown over the years? When I was growing up, autism was probably defined as Caitlin, right? Now it's defined as kind of on the spectrum. I think, like, it's not my expertise, but I think that's kind of the difference in what we're seeing and why we're seeing more of these numbers grow and more people identified, because people, well, and we know from working with Sertoma as past presidents that, if we know that if you're not on reading level by third grade, you have a 50% chance of being on welfare or jail.
Mm-hmm.
And yet most people don't know that if you're not up to your verbal skills by the time of 3, you only have a 50% chance of being on reading level
Right.
by third grade. So by the age of 3, 25% have kind of been I don't want to say preordained, because that just sounds so like you can't do anything, but 25% are likely to end up at 3, likely to end up either on welfare or jail.
Yeah.
And so now you take people like Caitlin, that includes those folks, right? So who aren't going to be on verbal track by 3, they're not going to be on third grade reading level, and maybe that's a skewed statistic, but that is the statistic.
Well, and like we said, autism, I mean, there's so many different degrees. I mean, you have people like Caitlin that have a Rain Man mentality where she can remember things from when she was 4 years old. I mean, she can give you a video with the date and where we were at was something someone said when she was 4. And, but then she doesn't have the dexterity in her hands to write well, or, she loves to read and things like that. But, she just will never be a full functioning adult on her own.
Right.
So advocates, families, and even celebrities like Holly Robinson Pete pushed back hard. She clapped on X saying her autistic son has a job, pays taxes, and absolutely hasn't destroyed their family. So of course, everybody, the people who get easily offended took this all the wrong way. And, knowing what we know with Caitlin, I don't think that's what he meant at all. And, RFK, he later did say that he was specifically referring to nonverbal individuals with severe autism, not everyone on the spectrum. He accused the media of taking his words out of context, which we know happens all the time. But by then the damage was done.
Well, and I think he needs to take some responsibility for some lazy language.
Right.
And so, this one isn't, I like beating up on the media just as much as the next guy. But this one doesn't sound like it's completely media driven. He said what he said without, assuming that people knew what he was talking about. And so I would throw this in, it's partly his responsibility not to use lazy language,
right,
and to be more clear in his language.
Right. So what is actually in the executive plan is he's ordering studies into possible environmental causes, things like toxins, mold, pesticides, food, and additives, which I think is amazing. He wants preliminary findings by September, which has many scientists rolling their eyes because complex neurological disorders don't exactly hand over answers on a tight deadline. So there's always tensions between raising awareness and respecting lived experience. But how should public officials handle talking about autism without alienating the very people that it helps?
Yeah. One thing I'd like to just step back on, yes, we're not going to start a study today and have answers by September, but there's no reason why we can't go back utilizing AI to past studies and input these environmental factors. We know that, whatever, in 1985, maybe there was more dye or a different dye that has since been outlawed.
Yeah.
That food companies were using. And so we can go back and adjust some of those things, probably using AI to maybe get a better grasp and, not come to a full conclusion by September, but maybe have a better idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that. I mean, I'm not an AI expert, but it certainly seems like that would be viable.
Yeah. I mean, you have to look at it and also, the vaccines, everything like that. I mean, there's one of the nonprofits here in Sarasota for childhood cancer was talking about how there's a place in Northport where there is an alarming amount of kids who are suffering from the same type of leukemia. So
we know that happens.
You can't tell me that there's not something environmental that's
we know
there.
that there's environmental factors that affect, impact cancer, and they impact people at different ages sometimes. So we know that the environment can be part of it, which would say, hey, I know that the number of vaccines children receive today is much greater than the number of vaccines we received.
Yeah.
And so, that's probably a good thing, but do we need to study more? Maybe some of these can be stretched out over, 8 or 10 years instead of trying to pack them all in prior to, children going to school at 5, or if they're going to pre-K, at 3 or 4, or whatever age, so maybe there's some other, practical applications, things we can do as a society to say, hey, I know plenty of people who are vaccine afraid. They're not anti-vaxxers, but they're vaccine, afraid. And so instead of having, all these vaccines by the time their children were 1 or 18 months, there's like, let's put them on a program so they have them by the time they're 5.
Yeah.
And so they spread them out.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctor will do that. They're scheduled for this, but if you ask, if you work with your doctor, and that's something you're concerned about, I don't see any problem with spreading them out.
Right. Okay, so next we're going to jump into President Trump just signed an executive order that basically changes the way federal agencies pick their office spaces. So I thought this was interesting. Yeah.
How federal agencies pick their office spaces.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was under the impression that, say, like the IRS building is the IRS building. That hasn't changed. Like, you're talking about the office spaces within the IRS building?
Yeah, I bet if you let me finish reading that we'll get to that.
All
right. So before
this is what happens.
Before this, thanks to old rules from Carter and Clinton years, government offices had to be placed in expensive downtown areas or historic buildings, which sounds great, but it's expensive for maintenance and upkeep and all of that, right? So Trump's new plan says no. We're going to cut costs and put these offices wherever it makes sense. Think cheaper rent, more flexibility, and maybe closer to where people actually live. So on paper, it's a money saver and a government efficiency booster, but could this mean less access in big cities, or even worse, a bunch of bland office parks in the middle of nowhere? So what this means is agencies will now get to pick their own locations, no more forced leases in high cost areas. Obviously, part of the bigger push to cut down costs in underused government buildings. It could free up billions in real estate and leasing costs over time. And supporters say it's about efficiency, but critics worry it might reduce access to urban residents. So you've worked in and around government for decades. Do moves like this actually lead to cost savings or just press release headlines?
Both is the short answer if it's implemented and done in a fair way. So I was under the misunderstanding you were talking about offices in Washington, D.C. You're talking about like the Social Security Administration in downtown St. Petersburg. Yes. Is there a place that's cheaper that they can serve as many people? And this also has to do with who you get to work there, who travels to work there. So,
it's about getting people back to the office too.
So it's not only that, but what is the commute to downtown St. Petersburg, where if you put it in Brandon, you would have cheaper rent, you'd have cheaper, but now people who live in St. Petersburg would have to drive across the bridge, type of thing. And so there's pros and cons, but we are in a spot as a federal government and citizens who support a balanced budget where we have to make cost-cutting measures. We have to. There's no question about it. So I love the idea of our government supporting historic buildings, but I'd rather have an idea of, a company supporting those historic buildings, right? We don't have to get rid of the historic buildings. And, so why is the government having to rent these higher dollar places that, like you said, and not to mention that the historic building now has to go through asbestos compliance, lead paint compliance, go down the list of all the things that you have to comply with so your workers are safe. And so and that has to be, so the federal government's incurring those costs. And so it sounds to me like especially the historic building part could be kind of a boondoggle for whoever owns the historic building.
Yeah.
And so this administration's not about boondoggles. It's about cutting costs and trying to balance the budget and reducing our debt. And so in that regard, it sounds like a great idea. The devil will be in the details. But I think that it's something that can and will be done. Now, it probably takes this administration and the next one. If the next president reverses it, because these leases aren't short-term leases in all likelihood. They're
Right.
They're probably cheaper to stay in the short term than get out. Because if you get getting out of it, who knows what the clause is to get out of a lot of these leases.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, and even some company, like I remember when I worked, in town, they didn't pay for my parking. So, I mean, I had a parking pass, but it was 2 miles away from where I worked.
Yeah.
So if it was raining, if it was snowing, whatever it was, if I wanted to park closer, I had to pay to park closer or try to find a spot somewhere, on the street or whatever.
And I'm kind of surprised the government doesn't own more of those buildings. So
Yeah.
that's perplexing. Why the government that's going to be here 100 years from now, hopefully.
Well, even if they do own it, there's still the maintenance of these buildings.
Maintenance, yeah, sure. But if you own the building, that's a whole different issue, because at some point you no longer have a payment.
Yeah.
But I also know, just from dealing in government for a long time, the government doesn't own any of the post office buildings. Those are all privately owned.
Yeah.
And rented back to the post office, which also makes no sense. You have the post office there for 100 years, and why isn't the post office buying that building, paying it off in 30 years like everyone else, and then having it for 70 years only with maintenance?
Right.
So it sounds to me like it can be a great cost cutting measure. Devil's in the details.
Seems like probably one of the easier things to get done to save money.
And look how hard it is.
Yeah.
Like, are you going to get it done in 4 years? Absolutely not. And moving an office is not cheap. Moving 100 employees or whatever it is not cheap.
If the majority of people were working from home, we've let some people go from the federal offices. It's the right time to do it. Let's just do it, cut costs, and.
Well, it's the right time to do it because we have a president who's willing to cut costs instead of just line people's pockets with money just for the sake of doing it.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this kind of leads us into the next one, which is sparking outrage and applause, depending on where you're sitting politically. But President Trump just signed a memo aimed at preventing illegal immigrants from getting Social Security benefits. So it's already illegal for them to have it, but it doubles down on the new enforcement tactics, like ramping up fraud prosecution, reviewing how Social Security checks get issued, and going after errors in government databases. So it isn't just about stopping fraud. It's a bold political move with where no freebies for those, here illegally. So what it actually does is it expands fraud investigations in at least 50 U.S. attorney offices, reinstates civil monetary penalty programs for people or entities involved in benefit fraud, targets mismatched Social Security records, including the serious weird problem of people over 100 years old still earning wages, and warns states and localities to verify eligibility or face consequences. So it's a big deal because it's not just policy, it's campaign messaging in an executive order form, and it opens the door to state versus federal battles, especially in sanctuary cities or blue states with more lenient documentation rules. There's also concern that legit citizens and legal immigrants might get swept up in the chaos. So especially if the databases aren't accurate, which we know they aren't. So is this about stopping real fraud, or is this more about signaling Trump's base that he's taking a hard line on immigration?
Yeah, again, probably both. This is, the fraud that exists in Social Security is real. I think it's probably just as real for people who have a dead parent who somehow has slipped through the cracks and they're still getting checks, as much as illegal immigrants, right? Because there's probably a whole lot more of those than. So I think you have to look at the whole basis of it. But the thing here is to ensure and to codify that we're going to stop fraud wherever we can. And if you are committing fraud, you're now being looked at. So it's sort of like Walmart having the greeter. If you have a greeter at Walmart, there's less shoplifting, because it's like, oh, you feel like somebody's there and they've got an extra person just say hello to you as you walk in the door. So they must have people watching all the cameras.
Mm-hmm.
And so So I think it's as much a signal to people who are committing fraud to stop it, or you're going to get caught and you're going to be prosecuted for it. And I think that goes for citizens, legal immigrants, and illegal immigrants. You know, the issue about blue sanctuary cities or blue states, it appears that per capita people get more government funds in these blue states than in red states. And so is that because blue states are committing more resources to trying to get people the proper funds they deserve, or is it fraud?
Yeah.
And so I don't have the answer to that, but I think that will play out over the next 3 years with this administration, because there's clearly seems to be some lines between the effectiveness of people getting government funds in blue areas versus red.
Yeah. And I remember when I moved down here, the first job that I had, that moved me to Florida, they came in, were taking one of my employees out, and she was a Hispanic girl. And, when they didn't tell me why, they just said that there was a problem with her I-9, and they had to, let her go. And I caught up to her before she actually walked out the building. I'm like, what happened? And she said my social security number was fake. And she had been working for the company for almost 10 years.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of that. It's not hard. I understand it's not hard. I've not tried it to get a fake social security number. So,
but a lot of things are still, I mean, you have your credit that goes with social security number, but even now, like, you don't even have to, you used to have to report your social security number on medical and everything like that, and you don't have to do that anymore. I don't know. I don't know if the social security number is going to be.
Seems like there's fewer checks and balances, and so this is maybe a layer of trying to bring in another check and balance.
Well, there has to be something. I mean, like, especially with your name, right? Jamie Miller is very common,
I graduated in a class of 92 people with another James Miller.
Yeah. So, how is the social security number the only thing that keeps you from, helps you identify yourself? Like, it's crazy to think that it's just,
Of course, we had our Homeland Security problem after after coming back from our honeymoon.
Yeah. So
you'll have to watch another episode.
I don't know why this cat is chewing on this chair, but he's making me crazy. Stop it. Okay.
We have a little crowd today.
We do. I don't know what it is with this room.
We have an audience, live studio audience. Yeah. We're going to have to start charging ticket prices.
All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is it's going to hit us all right in the medicine cabinet, the price of prescription drugs. So President Trump just dropped a new executive order aimed at slashing those prices, and it's packed with everything from Medicare reforms to insulin for pennies. So we've heard these promises before. He did it in his first run also, right? But the difference is this time is that it's going after hospital pricing. So the Medicare will now have to pay based on what a hospital would pay for drugs. So we're talking about the payments could be cut down by 35%. Standardized cancer drug pricing. So treatments like chemotherapy would cost the same whether you're getting them in a hospital or a clinic, potentially slashing prices up to 60%. And insulin and EpiPen access for uninsured and low income patients, insulin could cost as little as 3 cents plus a service fee. Epinephrine injectors like EpiPens could drop to $15. This is huge.
And this is right in your wheelhouse. This is more in your wheelhouse than it is mine. I mean, that's all of what you just shared are things that I haven't heard before, and it's exciting. And
you don't keep up with the White House news.
That I don't read every press release, believe it or not. So thank you for doing that and pointing out that I don't. But this is certainly in your wheelhouse.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the drug importation from countries like Canada. States can set up their own programs to buy drugs from abroad, cheaper, same quality, and FDA approved, which is fantastic. So my question for you is, obviously we've heard these promises before. Do you think this one has teeth to actually bring the prices down, or is it more headline than change? Now, I know you
Well,
said you haven't read about it.
No, but like I am familiar with the reimportation of pharmaceuticals from, say, Canada, and maybe they've closed this loophole, so I'm going back a few years. But, in the past, they would come straight from China, come into Canada, never get tested, never get confirmed as the milligram dosage, the actual drug that they were, and then be sold in the United States as drugs from Canada. And so they were just kind of looping them through Canada and not really doing the due diligence of, the part that you say is FDA approved.
Yeah.
If these drugs are FDA approved, even if they're coming from foreign countries. And we know that most of our pharmaceuticals are coming from China now anyway. So hopefully those checks and balances are already in place that I haven't, since the last time I caught up with this issue, which has probably been more than 5 years ago.
Yeah. And I think it's awesome. I mean, if they can get this done,
Well, it makes
this
sense.
is going to be a huge
Like
thing
why
for
is there
people.
such a for instance, it was when I first went on Crestor, I was using a different generic, and it's like, oh, it quit working, so let's move to Crestor. Crestor was the new cholesterol drug at the time, $800 a month.
Wow.
This is 2008 or 10. Like it was, $800 a month. I'm like, oh, okay, well, let me. At that point, there just started to be kind of apps or programs you could go on and look. It seemed like so. I'd shop it. Oh, Publix 600. There's a different price between this CVS and that CVS.
Yeah.
And so you really had to go when you were dealing with and I got it down to like 350. What I ended up doing though was going to Mexico, and I'd just go buy it over the counter.
Wow.
And I'd buy a year's dose, and I would basically pay for my trip to Mexico to covering my drugs.
That's crazy.
And so and they seemed to work for as long as I did that. I probably did that for 5 or 10 years.
And now I think they're all basically free through Publix.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, the Publix, we've talked about this before, is kind of using it as a loss leader. We want you to come in and buy our groceries, so we'll give you some of these drugs that are generic for free.
Okay, so our final story is this one kind of caught me off guard, and I know that this goes back to Signalgate and all of that, but
which reared its ugly head again today.
Yeah,
but
it did, and it leads into that. So the Pentagon is in chaos, right? So 3 top aides to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth were abruptly fired, and it all seems to circle back to Elon, which this is what really threw me. So the briefing that
is Elon back evil in your book or not?
No, because and honestly, it's going to sound funny the way that I'm going to explain how I see this happening. But so the briefing that blew up was in March. Elon Musk was scheduled to attend a Pentagon meeting about U.S. military plans if tensions with China escalate. So why Musk, right? I mean, he has companies, Starlink are increasingly integrated into U.S. military infrastructure, but there's a catch. He also has major business interests in China, which made some officials uneasy. Trump didn't know about this. So when he found out that Musk was going to be part of this meeting, he actually said, what the F is Elon doing there? And make sure he doesn't go, which to me is great, right?
For him, right.
Look, don't stay in your lane, buddy. Like there's no reason for you to be in that meeting. And just like that, the meeting was shut down and the leak hunt began. So I asked AI, who invited Elon to this meeting?
So here's a little behind the curtain view of Washington, D.C. This is an old Washington, D.C. trick. They always say when you're hired that you walk into every meeting until you get to a meeting that's high enough that somebody kicks you out. And so, and that's
I don't think this was the case, but I get it.
That's 100% the case. Elon found out a meeting and said, "I'm going."
That is not true. So Pete Hegseth actually invited him.
Okay,
to this meeting. Okay, which
I stand corrected. All I'm suggesting is that it's not abnormal for people of all levels of Washington D.C. government to try to quote sneak into meetings that they're there is either no reason for them to be there, or it's above their pay grade
Yeah.
to try to gain or make it look like they have more power than they have.
Right. And I
And
get that.
so,
I absolutely get that.
so that's where I was headed with that.
Yeah.
But if you're telling me he was invited, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. And in my thought you know, I don't have a lot of what's the word I'm thinking of? Confidence in Pete Hegseth. I really don't. Like, I think that he's a new kid that, you know, he didn't come out and tell Trump about Signalgate. He didn't tell him what was happening, which he should have. And now he's inviting Musk to meetings that Musk has no right to be involved in. And so to me, it's like Hegseth is that new employee who needs a buddy, who doesn't feel comfortable going to the boss yet, who's, you know, trying to...
And he just got raked over the coals with Signalgate.
Yeah, and he just got raked over the coals, which you would think would make him a little bit more cognizant and be like, oh, okay, well, maybe I need to watch, because now we found out that the information from Signalgate was actually given to his sister, given to his brother, given to other people, which is going to be a problem.
Yeah, I don't... you know, what broke today is exactly that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to stand by that the information, if it's the exact same information, if it's exact same information, it's not like he shared classified material or anything. But if he's sharing Department of Defense information with non-government family members, that seems to be a problem. I mean, that's, you know,
he just reminds me of that person who has power and is flaunting that power.
Is he flaunting it, or is he just, or is it kind of the opposite? And not that we are going to do a psychological profile of Pete Hegseth, but why not? You know, is he flaunting that power, or is he looking for acceptance? Is he looking for acceptance from his family? Look, I made it. Look what I know. Look what I'm, you know.
Who the hell cares? I mean, right. You're in a position of what is he, the Secretary of Defense?
Secretary of Defense.
I mean, are you freaking kidding me? Excuse me. There's no fighting on the podcast. Except between me and Jamie, not the brothers. Yeah, I mean, grow up.
Yeah.
Like, seriously, grow up. I mean, you need to know this job enough that you should know who needs to be in the room. You should know who you can and can't talk about things to. Like, he just seems like that
he's out of his depth. Yeah, maybe he's out of his depth, and you know, and that was the concern. You know, a lot of people had with him going in. You know, a lot of us kind of said, "Hey, it's Trump's person. Let's continue to, you know, support Trump by supporting his people." And you know, that.
Well, you're the one who said that people get hired day one for the purpose of getting fired someday. Because you have to show that. You have to be able to show that you have to cut the ties. For me, he'd be gone. Like, already had be gone. Like, so these three guys.
Well, I'm sure the president made an internal thought, not a commitment to any of these people, but you know, there is a thought of you try to get as much done as you can within the first 100 days, and getting people hired is hard enough without then going through the chaos of firing them, and that consumes a news week. You know, so you're, you know, 4 or 5 days of your 100 that, you know, start getting into percentages of, you know, your first 100 days where you're trying to lay the foundation for the rest of your presidency. And so, you know, I know that he wouldn't want to fire somebody within the first 100 days, which we're approaching.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll see.
Okay.
But I do, you know, I have said to you that there are times, I don't know that you bring in someone at a cabinet level position for the sole purpose of firing them, you know, but I have said to you that there are people who you bring into the fold, or they force themselves into the fold, and then you cut them.
Yeah.
So that, you know, you show not only your opponents, but your supporters, you know, that we expect a certain level of conduct while you're here.
Right. So the fallout was multiple senior Pentagon officials, including Dan Caldwell and Darren Selnick, were placed on leave or fired. So the accusation was they were leaking details of the planned Musk briefing and potentially other classified info. Now, again, this is where I come back and say, well, why wasn't Hegseth why isn't he put on administrative leave if he's the one who's inviting Musk to these meetings? So Musk responded that he denied ever planning to receive classified intel and called the reports pure propaganda.
To split a hair here, it sounds like Hegseth maybe wasn't outside of the scope of his role of inviting Musk, but if these folks were outside of their role of leaking the information about Musk being invited, that's unacceptable behavior. Leaking to the press or to whomever that, I don't like what's going on with my superiors, and leaking it is an activity that very few people in DC will tolerate.
Okay.
So I think that's where, not to interrupt you, but that's kind of the hair I think that's being split here. And it's a fine hair, but it is one.
Okay. So why it matters is obviously if a civilian billionaire is this close to sensitive military conversations, what happens when his business interests don't align with U.S. national interest? The firings show a real breakdown of trust inside the Pentagon and raise questions about whether Hegseth can control his own inner circle. And it isn't just drama, it's about who has influence over war planning and how secure our national security really is. So how dangerous is it to have someone like Musk close to top level strategy talks, especially when he is doing business with China?
Yeah, so you're putting a lot of trust in him.
And I know that people have talked about this with Doge too, him having access.
This is the criticism Democrats have with Elon Musk, is that he hasn't gone through the confirmation hearings, right? Hegseth did. So if you want to put these two in
there was some
hierarchy of federal government,
right? But
Hegseth at least went through confirmation hearings, and Elon Musk has not.
Yeah.
So, granted, Hegseth is probably the only one in that meeting with that maybe isn't true, but he's one of maybe a handful of people in that meeting with confirmation approval, right?
Yeah.
Because some undersecretaries, generals, things like that get some level of national security.
But he wasn't like a unanimous vote either. That took a couple days.
No, nobody was a unanimous vote because we're so partisan right now.
Yeah.
So it's nobody's. I mean, Rubio, I think, was unanimous, and that is that's part of being part of the U.S. Senate. So U.S. senators, as a general rule, if you don't get a unanimous vote out of the U.S. Senate, it's normally because you have a personality conflict with fellow U.S. senators, because that's just the way that body works.
Yeah.
And so I think Rubio was unanimous, or 99-0 or whatever it was. But, as far as people getting fired for leaking, I don't see a problem with that. I do think that is part of, Hegseth. If people are being critical of him not controlling his inner circle, and those folks are in the inner circle and they're leaking. Yeah.
But let's talk about that. I mean, had they not leaked this information, had that meeting gone on and Trump didn't know about it, and then Elon is sitting in on this meeting that could have contained information, I mean, is that not worse?
So here's the way that would be. I don't want to make Musk more important or less important than he is. He is as important as he is to the president, but it seems like he's probably at the level of like a chief of staff, where he can go directly to the president if he wants. Everybody who works for the president can't, right? So
including Pete Hegseth
can go directly to the president if he wants.
Yes.
So yes, I agree with that. So he's at that level of, whether it includes confirmation or not, where if he doesn't have the trust of the president, he certainly appears to have the trust of the president. And so, now it's worrisome that I think, I don't know that worrisome's too strong a word. I think it does raise some concern if Hegseth invited him, and for whatever's being talked about. But for whatever reason, Hegseth wanted his experience and expertise in the room. For whatever reason, we don't know that, and I certainly don't want to speculate on it. I can certainly see where people are critical, but my guess is the people who are being critical are the people who are critical about everything. So just like people will take my opinion of being for the president with a grain of salt who are against the president.
Yeah.
We also have to kind of be extra critical of people who are critical on every single thing, right? So if you're one of those 49 senators or 48 senators who are critical against about the president for everything, and this is just the next thing for this week, it's getting worse. It's getting that's just as bothersome to me as Elon being in the
I'm
mixture.
bothered by this though.
But if
I'm literally bothered by
but
this.
if you're talking about people who are from both sides of the aisle who say, hey, listen, what's going on? And I think I do think that's probably the case here, but I don't know that to be the case. But if that's the case here, what power does Elon Musk have from the president? And, and if the president wasn't aware,
I'm not even concerned about Elon. I'm concerned about Pete Hegseth.
So you're concerned about Pete Hegseth inviting Elon
and then showing text to his family or showing intel, whatever it may be, to his family. Like, this guy's not, I'm sorry, but that is not acceptable. It's not acceptable.
I'm not going to disagree with you on that, but we're talking about two different issues.
Well, I understand that, but it's, I mean, the Elon thing was walking into this, but then thinking about the whole thing, like, I'm not mad at Elon. He was invited to a meeting. He's like, I'm going to go.
Right.
That's
the Secretary of Defense invites. Hey, if the Secretary of Defense invites me to a meeting, guess what? I'm flying to DC and going.
Right. Like, this
right?
is nothing against Elon.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand where, and yes, that's the question. Could there be issues with him being in the meeting? The way that Trump responded to it, yeah, there's probably some issue.
So now your concern, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but your concern, just so I can understand it, is more, what was Pete Hegseth's motivation?
Absolutely.
So
is he just not confident enough in his own ability that he, and this is just what, like I told you, this is the way that I'm seeing it. Like, he needs to have that little buddy, that work friend that he gets along with, that, he wants him to be part of all of his stuff. So he's inviting him. Like, I don't know. This is just not sitting right.
I think something I wrote in one of my Substacks was that when you're very few people have the experience to manage a federal department the size of the Department of Defense. I mean, you think about the people who, quote, have experience.
Yeah.
There's 50 who may have run companies the size of the Department of Defense, and with the importance of everyday decisions being so very critical, and critical worldwide. And, the question I had, for Hegseth was, yeah, you're in this silo, but have you ever been in a position where, you think there's 3 silos and 2 of them are with you and one's against you, but then you get in a position, you realize there's actually 8 or 10 silos.
Yeah.
And the intra Department of Defense politics, not even Republican, Democrat, just the internal politics of, even take Army versus Navy versus Air Force, Coast, all of those things.
Yeah.
You have those politics. Well, then you have the politics of, just every layer of, hey, this one needs $1 billion for this weapon system, or that one wants $1 billion for this weapon system. Which one wins this year?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of moving parts in the Department of Defense. And so the question was, does Hegseth have what it takes to lead that? And, he seems like a good guy, and
I don't care how good of a guy you are.
That's the point. I'm not trying to say that in spite of him being a good guy, it seems like, he's certainly treading water at best. And, some people tread water and then swim. And so is it the question, that you have, other people have, and I think more people are going to be concerned with, if there are more missteps, is he
how many more missteps does he get?
Drowning? I don't know. Like, that's not up to me. That's up to the president of the United States. So it's, is he drowning? And the question is, does the president of the United States think he's drowning? And number 2, who's on deck? So you have another, because again, go back to there's 50 or 100 people who qualify to be Secretary of Defense, so are you, who's on deck to do that? Governor Ron DeSantis. I still think that DeSantis should have taken, I don't know that it was offered to him, but I speculated
his $10 million was going somewhere else.
Well, and maybe they knew about it and they're like, hey, this guy has a problem that we don't want to take on.
Yeah.
And, but if I speculated that he was offered the Secretary of the Navy, and that I speculated as well that DeSantis probably felt that that was beneath him. And then when Hegseth stumbled during his confirmation hearings, DeSantis pushed to be, DOD secretary. And, that may still be something that gets worked out. I mean, like I said, despite kind of looking at the political landscape and saying, oh, behind the scenes, DeSantis is trying to, thwart Trump or take the credit for all the things that Trump is doing, he and Casey are still going to meet with President Trump once a month.
Yeah.
And so what's happening in those meetings is undetermined from what I can tell. I mean, I can speculate, but I certainly I've not spoken to anybody who has shared what really has happened in those meetings.
All right. Well, that's all I have to talk about. So do you have anything that you want to?
No, I think this was a great show.
All right.
Hopefully those of you who fact checked, during the show, I didn't make too many things up. From I think you put together a great show. Thank you.
We have the cutest guests. I mean, look at this guy.
Well, Nala fell asleep down here, it looks like. Yeah,
so sweet. You can't even see him on camera.
So, anyway, well, yeah, great show, babe.
All right. See you next time.
This has been Reasonable Arguments News and Nonsense. There is so much BS on the mainstream media news, but you knew that. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. See you next time as husband and wife duo Jamie and Jennifer keep it real on Reasonable Arguments